Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. The President of the United States using salty language about his foreign policy. Thaddeus McCotter, WJR, the great voice of the Great Lakes, and John Fund of the National Review Online joined me. A new report from Josh Rogan at the Daily Beast that the President these last days invited Senate and House leaders to the White House to discuss foreign policy. And a bipartisan opinion emerged from this conversation, according to the reporting here. The bipartisan opinion was that the president's foreign policy has not been adequate, especially in matters of major importance for conflict zones. Syria, ISIS, that would be Iraq, Russia, and Ukraine. Mr. Obama responded with salty language. I will quote the president, not at all. This is a family program, and you can read it for yourself. However, I welcome my colleagues because this immediately reminds me, since I've been reading my Life magazines faithfully recently, of 1966. Of course, everything reminds me of the 60s. 1966, when Richard Nixon was out campaigning for the Republicans, who were at an all-time low in the House and the Senate after the overwhelming wave election of 64 for Lyndon Johnson. Mr. Nixon was campaigning against Lyndon Johnson, not just on domestic matters. He was avoiding chiefly the conflict of domestic matters, but on the Vietnam War, and that the Johnson administration, particularly the president, had an ad hoc policy. They were making it up as they go along. There was a meeting called in Manila that year by the President of the United States to bring in the leaders of South Korea and Vietnam for a big powwow. We're going to settle this. We're not going to put any more soldiers into Vietnam. We're going to resolve this for a conflict for the zone. That led to no result whatsoever. Lyndon Johnson had to have a surgical procedure and took himself off the campaign trail. The point here is that what reminds me of Lyndon Johnson's ad hoc, and there's no more successful legislative president in the last half century than Lyndon Johnson, is the president's daily press conference from the golf course in Martha's Vineyard, responding to reports out of Iraq. So I begin with you, Mr. Fund. We thought this election was going to turn on for domestic policy, the Affordable Care Act or the Veterans Affairs or the immigration policy. Is it instead shifting entirely to bipartisan hammering of the president, so much so that he's agitated and using salty language, and that this will be a foreign policy vote? Good evening to you, John.
Well, as of now, no American troops are dying in any significant numbers overseas. That limits the penetration of foreign policy as an issue into the midterms. However, the chaos overseas rattles independents who don't like confusion. And I believe if you look at the president's approval numbers, 40% overall, 36% for the economy, foreign policy only 33%. I think they may be people, and we're already seeing shifts in the votes of Jewish Americans who believe this president knows not what he is doing, and therefore he needs a wake-up call.
Thaddeus, I do not respond to daily press conferences, chiefly because it interrupts my preparation for the show at night, but the president had a press conference, I believe, on Friday. I believe he had another remark on Saturday, and then one today, reacting to surprising and threatening developments in Iraq. That doesn't tell me that the White House is ahead of this. When you were in Congress watching the Bush administration respond, react, and defend itself from the poor conduct of the Iraq war, did that suggest to you that things were going badly for the election?
No, but he had a plan. The Johnson analogy from '66 with Nixon was about an ad hoc foreign policy, which, being Nixonian, was probably relatively unfair to Mr. Johnson. But in this case, it is an ad hoc policy. The press conferences you're talking about to respond to developments, even if one is leading from behind, is indicative of an administration that is going day to day, hour by hour in terms of its foreign policy. With the Bush administration, as Mr. Fund remembers, is, if anything, it was too dogged in the policy course that it set up until the surge with Petraeus then shifted course.
All right, I'll stay with the fact you make a sharp distinction between Mr. Bush's handling of a foreign policy crisis and Mr. Obama's ad hoc. I think we're being generous here, but it's time to be diplomatic. John, what is this salty language. Is this the Mr. Cool being rattled? I don't mean to be sarcastic about the president, but it has been something that recommended him to his voters these long years, that he does not become agitated or upset or rebuke his critics when under pressure. But this report suggests that it did happen to him just during vacation time.
Yes, and just before he left for vacation, he gave an interview to Tom Friedman of the New York Times in which he seemed to indicate that Republicans were the fault of all problems in the U.S. No drama Obama is becoming peevish.
And that peevishness, John, what does it mean? I mean, you say that no American troops are dying, and that's a good thing. I understand that. But the voters, especially midterm voters, are they sensitive to a president who's lost vision or at this point has not demonstrated that he knows where he's going?
The theme that Republicans can drive home is America is weaker economically than ever, and it is weaker in terms of foreign policy than it has been in decades. That form of weakness undermines the American exceptionalism the president claims to have but really doesn't, but many voters have it. And to see America slip into second-tier status, potentially, will rattle a lot of voters, and they, shall we say, may want to arrest that by casting votes in a different direction.
Thaddeus, John refers to Jewish voters reassessing their loyalty to the president. I believe the Jewish vote has been in the 70s each time Mr. Obama stood for election, and it's very strong for the Democratic Party. He's pointing to Gaza, for obviously, and the Gaza conflict is unfinished. Is there a measure from your point of view about how the president's doing in Gaza? It's been lost these last days because of the collapse of Iraq.
Well, a lot of it's been lost, John. And I think that Mr. Fun's point is actually the one that matters. It's America in retreat. We are on the verge of a generational defeat in Iraq and as well as Afghanistan. This is not a new war. It is one that has continued from the Bush administration through the Obama administration, and all the wishful thinking in the world couldn't make it go away. And he's frustrated with this. In terms of Gaza, I think it, as we've talked about before, it continues to cause problems not only with our allies in Israel, but with our allies in Egypt, who do not want to see Hamas strengthened and are actively trying to prevent that. So overall, it becomes a case of chaos. Is the sense in this country of decline and chaos, and I think that right now it is.
The quote in Josh Rogan's piece, John, and this is a breaking news story. You can all go to your Daily Beast site and see it. This is from Eliot Engel, whom I talk to often. He's ranking Democrat on House Foreign Affairs Committee, and he represents the people of New York from the New York delegation. Engel said, the president still feels very strongly we are deluding ourselves if we think American intervention in Syria early on by assisting these rebels would have made a difference. He still believes that. I disagree respectfully. They were not looking for U.S. troops. They were looking for help, and the Syria civil war started with the most noblest of causes. It's peculiar to me, John, that the president's stuck on Syria, that it comes back and back and back to Syria. Is the president at this point, to your knowledge, John, conveying his policy to the Democratic Party, to his own side? I can see the Republicans using these wedges to rattle him at election time, but not the Democrats.
Well, the president said his foreign policy motto was "Don't do stupid things."
Right.
Well, the humiliation he suffered in Syria, where he drew a red line, retreated from it, ham-handed effort to consult with Congress, a bizarre agreement with the Soviets to broker the transfer of chemical weapons. By the way, the best guess we have from the Obama administration is that 60% of the chemical weapons in Syria are still there, and it's been a year. That's a foreign policy success. That was a foreign policy humiliation.
Foreign policy success. It's hard to find one right now. Let's see. Killed bin Laden. I don't want to get sarcastic. I want to stay with this. Thaddeus, what we have in Ukraine is an ongoing crisis for Europe, winter coming on. It's lost these last days, but the report out of Moscow is that Vladimir Putin is headed to Crimea, Sevastopol, and other cities in Crimea to make speeches and distribute money within these next days. The Obama administration has not, for some weeks, emphasized its best outcome in Ukraine. To me, Thaddeus, this looks like the major conflict. Vladimir Putin has nukes, and he has a pretty good army. It's not what it was during the Soviet years, but it can certainly match anything NATO's got.
Well, to bring this around to square, close the circle, if you will, you have an individual, Mr. Putin, who has a plan. He has a short-term plan. He has an intermediate plan. He has a long-term plan. The expansion of the power and prestige and wealth of the Russian nation. And that's why you consider this one of the most important contests, is because you're watching a man with a plan deal with a president that doesn't.
Barack Obama ran in 2008 and for re-election in 2012 entirely on the basis of a domestic agenda. Right now we're talking foreign policy. It's not natural, it's not a home court advantage to Barack Obama. When we come back, I'll ask my professionals, John Fund and Thaddeus McCotter, whether the American people will regard these foreign policy stumbles as part of a learning experience, or whether it will be a measure against the Obama administration for the final 2 years. I'm John Batchelor.